Let me show you how I go about starting and planning a new Warhammer force. I'll walk you through my thought process, the steps involved, and even some budget saving tips. So generally speaking, when I start a new army, I consider 4 things. 1, what faction I want to play. 2, how I want the army to play, or the playstyle. 3, which units I want on the board. And 4, how I'll want to make it look unique on the tabletop. Over the next few weeks, you'll see me put this plan into action as I build a whole new force, the Sparisian Revolutionaries. So let's start with part 1, choosing a faction. This is usually the easiest step. If you're new, go with which army you think looks coolest. You've probably already been inspired by some models or maybe some pieces of art, so go with that. For me, as a more experienced hobbyist, I want to make something I've not done before. So I'm going to challenge myself a bit. I'm trying an Imperial Guard based army. I've always loved the Death Corps of Krieg. I first saw them as a kid as an alternate scheme for the Armageddon Steel Legion and thought, wow, those look neat, but never took the plunge. They're due to get a new update in the coming weeks, so I'm going to build something based on these new models. Next is part 2, deciding on a playstyle. If you're new to Warhammer, the idea of a playstyle might seem a bit odd to plan for, but if you plan on playing games with your force, you'll want your force to synergize. If you're planning on just painting a force for display, you can normally just pass on this step without much thought. But at a very basic level, and veteran players please cover your ears, Warhammer armies often tend to boil down to one of 3 things. A, gunline armies with lots of ranged firepower. B, combat armies focused on melee. Or C, a combined army, which is a bit of both. Each of these 3 are then typically broken down into a further 3 things. Either elite armies with fewer, tougher units, horde armies with tons of weaker units, or, again, something in between. So for a few examples, take Space Marines. They tend to be combined arms elite armies. Lots of small units that are good at both shooting and combat. Then you'll have something like Imperial Guard, who are a horde gunline army who are great at shooting but tend to be pretty poor in combat. Then you have something like the World Eaters, who are combat monsters with chain axes galore and a mix of elite marines and horde chaff. There's plenty more depth, such as hammer and anvil units, wind conditions, but those are good basics. For my Sparisian Revolutionaries, I'm going to channel a bit of a Zap Brannigan vibe. Wave after wave of my own troops being flushed into my enemies. So it'll be a kind of horde gunline rabble. I then tend to move on to part 3, selecting units. Usually there are 1 or 2 particular units that will call out to you at first. If you're playing Space Marines, maybe it's Blade Guard veterans with their swords and shields. Or maybe it's a giant bug from the Tyranids. Start with one of the units that stands out to you and plan your army around them. If you're super lucky, they might even belong to one of the combat patrol boxes that you can normally grab at a bit of a discount. If you don't know what unit they are, take a look at what's available for the army on the Warhammer website. I then normally create a list of around 1,000 points using a list building tool. There are a few available. You can get the official apps from the App Store for 40k and AOS, but you won't get the official rules for them without a codex key. There are a few other options that are free and easy to use. I'll link them in the comments section for each of the 4 main Warhammer games. Then the final thing is part 4, making it unique. This is obviously a very subjective thing. You can build your army straight out of the box and paint it in official colors as you like. I've done this plenty of times. But if you want to make something special, there are easily a few little things that you can do to add a bit of creativity and uniqueness to your minis. They're generally broken into 2 categories. First, you can kit bash or convert your models to give them a bit of personality. This typically involves taking bits from kits that they don't originally come with and mixing them with others to create a new looking unit. For my Black Templars, for example, I wanted my sword brethren to look like old school paladins, so I kit bashed a number of them with Blade Guard bits to get them shields, meaning I can run them as Blade Guard veterans as well as Sword Brethren if I want to. You can also use alternate sculpts instead of standard sculpts. A good example of this is using Horus Heresy minis for 40k units. My Predators and Terminators for my Word Bearers are great examples of this, and very easy too. You can also look at 3D prints for things like arm and head swaps, or just whole new minis entirely. Then the other part of this is colour schemes. This part for me often takes up the most brain space. I'll typically want to create something that will stand out, but I like to speed paint, so I want something simple-ish to work with. If a specific piece of art or a painted model range caught your eye, embrace that and run with it, especially if it's your first time. For the Sparisian Revolutionaries, I'm leaning into a pre-French World War I style vibe. The Krieg themselves are based on French World War I troops, but I want to go back a bit further with them and add a bit more flair. I've spent some time looking up historical images and references to inspire me, and these old magazine prints and cartoons are really pushing me into a particular look, but more on that later. When it comes to painting, you can customize an existing scheme with small twists. For this, you can use alternating pauldrons or helmet colors. As an example, I built a small Chaos Warband for Slaves to Darkness, who wanted to make them look like they'd come from some frozen part of the mortal realms. So I did blue capes instead of the classic red to make them feel much cooler. I also added some snowy bases. You could also create a completely new color scheme. It's entirely your choice, it's your arm. It took me a little bit of time to get to a point where I felt comfortable creating something unique, and I'm still experimenting with it. So using these 4 steps, here's my plan for the Sparisian Revolutionaries. I've chosen the Imperial Guard as the faction, easy. I've always loved the gas mask trench warfare aesthetic of the Deathcore Krieg, so I definitely want to use those units in the list. I've also always wanted to paint some Lehman Russes, so I'll make sure the list has those too. As they're revolutionaries, I've opted to base it on these 1900 cartoons of French soldiers. And for playstyle, we're going for a full horde of revolutionaries. It did take me some time to arrive at these decisions. To get really on with the Renegade Guard feel, I originally considered Genestealer Cult Kriegsmen, the Kriegstealer cults. I never really fully clicked with the conversions, and I'm not a huge fan of the bulbous heads that the cults have.
Oh my god, what's wrong with your face?
So I would really struggle to paint them over time. A friend then suggested trying something inspired by the early 1900s French Revolutionary aesthetic. That's when I remembered the graphic novel I picked up a few years back, The Red Virgin and the Visions of Utopia, an account of the Paris Commune of 1871. To be very, very brief, during the Franco-Prussian War, citizens of Paris and members of the National Guard took control of Paris. After about 2 months, the French army cracked down, killing upwards of 20,000 communards. It's a fascinating, if tragic, slice of history, and it fits perfectly with the grimdark vibes of 40k. So instead of Paris Commune, I took Paris and tweaked it to Sparee. And imagine that Sparee is a world where citizens of the Guard rose up against the Imperium. It's more mundane than Genestealer cults or Chaos cultists, but in many ways more compelling. What happens when just regular members of the Imperium decide that they've had enough of tithes, inquisitors, the ecclesiarchy, and cast them down? So let's flesh out the army a bit more. The Guard portion will be Krieg models with some head swaps. These can act as the regular death core of Krieg in the Imperial Guard army list. Since it's a horde army, costs can skyrocket, so we'll need to get creative to save some money, like using Necromunda Cordor models, or Warhammer Fantasy, Empire, and Bretonnian kits to represent the city's peasants taking up arms. I can paint these up to represent Catagans or Cadians in the army list, and ensure they are distinct so my opponent will know what units represent what options. If you're totally new to purchasing Warhammer minis, let me just take a slight tangent. You do not need to buy kits directly from Games Workshop or Warhammer.com. Find your nearest gaming store and order from them. They typically do a discount on Warhammer products of up to 20%, and Games Workshop actually wants you to buy through these stores. Gaming stores take on the costs of hosting spaces for large gaming tables that Games Workshop no longer does. Without local gaming stores, the hobby around you becomes much harder to organise and get games in. Anyway, Tangent over. Finally, I want a special character to represent a grimdark version of Louise Michel, a famous figure from the Paris Commune and the Red Virgin herself. Another thing of importance during the Commune were cannons, so I'll kit bash some old school cannons into sci-fi artillery. These will be some of the standout units on the battlefield for me. I'm going to be working on this project over the next few months, so you'll be able to follow along with the progress as I work on it. I've already finished painting up one unit that coincidentally had a mild painting disaster that happened, so I look forward to sharing that one with you. Anyway, I hope that this has been somewhat helpful to you if you're starting a new army. I'd love to know what you're planning, and if you're starting a new army, I'd actually love to start featuring some of your units and armies at the end of my videos. So, you can now join the Pluckee's channel Discord server. Link in the doobly-doo. You can post your minis to the mini painting channel, and I'll start getting them posted at the end of my next video. I try to get videos out on Thursdays, so the deadline will be Tuesday evenings weekly. Thanks very much for watching, and do the YouTube stuff for me. It really helps the channel. Like, subscribe, you know the drill, and please leave comments. Let me know what you think of the video. I love reading them all, and I've been really enjoying responding to everyone. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.
Promote synergy.